Well, some decently good news out of the Supreme Court today. There was a decision made in West Virginia versus EPA, and the case was decided in favor of West Virginia and the coal industry. The crux of the decision came down to the EPA trying to regulate coal-fired power plants out of existence. The EPA wanted to impose CO2 emissions restrictions on coal-fired power plants in the form of, well, just shutting them down. They said, okay, you can only burn so much coal because that's going to emit CO2, and so we're just going to make you, only run for part of the day or part of the month or part of the week, whatever it was. They capped how long they could run. They wouldn't let these plants run 24 hours a day or as long as they wanted. So they limited the amount of power that you were allowed to generate via coal. And so in theory, eventually, the EPA could just limit the amount of power you're allowed to generate through coal-fired power plants all the way down to 0 kilowatts, and then there would be no more coal-fired power plants. And the Supreme Court said, no, this is obviously not what the Clean Air Act was about. The Clean Air Act does not give the EPA the power to outlaw, burning fossil fuels entirely. The Clean Air Act gives the EPA the reluctantly, I admit this, although I don't like it, gives the EPA the ability, legally, although I don't think that this is constitutional, to impose upon people who are burning fossil fuels that they take whatever precautions that are currently possible at a given, in the science of the time, to reduce their pollution into the air. I think that there is certainly room for trying to preserve the cleanliness of air and to reduce air pollution. I just think that the EPA is a terrible instrument for doing that, and that we could have done it through tort law, basically. But the courts kind of wrote that out of existence during the Industrial Revolution. They pretty much said that you can't sue over air pollution back then, and that's why we ended up with the EPA, which is far worse these days. But I don't really want to get into that. I don't want to get so much bogged down into the history of what came before the EPA and how we got there. But the fact of the matter is the Supreme Court recognized that way back in 1970, Congress did not grant the EPA the power to outlaw fossil fuels, and that obviously in 1970, Congress would not have intended that. That would have been crazy. Nobody back then would have ever imagined that the EPA would try to ban burning fossil fuels. And so all that they said is that the EPA can't tell coal-fired power plants how long they can run and how much coal they can burn and how much power they can generate. All they can do is impose upon them, these carbon capture schemes or after-treatment, particulate filters, those sorts of things. And so this is a win, which will certainly help America it will slow our backsliding into third world status, and it will keep our power grid running a little bit better. Because the Greens in America, just like the Greens in Europe, want to shut down every reliable source of power generation and replace it with wind and solar. And so the Supreme Court has pretty much put a stop to doing that entirely. They're not going to be able to just tell coal-fired power plants, no, you can't produce electricity. And likewise, they're not going to be able to just outlaw the internal combustion engine, at least not through the EPA. They're going to have to actually pass a law to do that. And Congress would be insane to do it. Now, I guess I shouldn't put it past them, but, generally speaking, Congress can't get stuff passed. And so I feel much better knowing that would have to go through Congress than knowing that just the EPA, with a stroke of a pen, some unnamed person within the EPA can decide we're going to outlaw internal combustion engines by 2030 because we're controlled by Bill Gates and George Soros and the Davos folks. The Supreme Court has explicitly said they can't do that. You can't just decide, no, people aren't allowed to burn gasoline and diesel fuel anymore. No, you can't tell people that they can't burn coal anymore. And so the ultimate goal of the anti-fossil fuel jihadists has been thwarted. This is a step in the right direction. Um, it's they didn't quite say that you have a constitutional right to burn fossil fuels. They didn't say that at all. But until Congress themselves decides to come in and tell you that you're not allowed to burn fossil fuels, which I think would be politically disastrous, and that's why Congress can't do it. It has to be through the EPA that does it, because if you outlaw fossil fuels, any kind of fossil fuel, which is going to be relatively less expensive than any alternative, that's why that's why alternative forms of energy are called alternatives. They're not just called energy, because if solar and wind and all these other things were better than fossil fuels, nobody would be burning fossil fuels. The reason why people burn fossil fuels to generate energy is because you get more energy for less money. And when people are struggling to cover their costs of living, when people can't afford their rent, when people just want to keep the lights on for their children, they're going to opt for the least expensive form of energy possible. And so if Congress wanted to put in writing, into law, and vote to take away less expensive forms of energy and force people via, black and white legislation to use this, ridiculous so-called renewable energy, I don't think that they would do it. And so this is an important decision. But the Supreme Court can't do everything. The Supreme Court can't totally protect us. They are just a court. What really needs to happen is the EPA needs to be gutted. They need to be completely defunded. You can't abolish them, I don't think, without legislation, but the president can pretty much just go in there and gut it, fire as many people as possible, replace them with people who have nothing but contempt for the EPA, which is what he was supposed to do in his first term. He chose not to. He chose not to fight that battle. And boy, has it cost us. The EPA has been running rampant over the last 6 years. It got worse after Trump got in because, they were just totally indignant. Once he backed down, they were emboldened, and they became far worse than they ever had been. And that's why at this point you basically can't buy a diesel truck. The only people who these days are choosing to buy diesels are, semi-truck drivers and dump truck drivers and that sort of thing, heavy-duty applications, because they're bogged down with so much emissions crap that it's just not practical to drive a diesel anymore, even though they are objectively better. When you remove all of the emissions garbage, they are a better power plant for, I think, every vehicle. Unless you're looking for a sports car, in principle, a diesel is always going to be a better option in every kind of vehicle. I think even in a motorcycle. There were diesel motorcycles in India. They got something crazy like, I forget how many miles per gallon. Motorcycles already get an insanely high fuel mileage compared to a car, because they're so much smaller and so much more efficient in that sense, because they're only having to carry around the weight of the frame, the tires, and the rider. But diesel motorcycles got like double that. And so if the EPA actually, this is part of the scam of the CO2 thing. It's just about limiting energy consumption or energy output. It's not about limiting CO2, because if you really wanted to limit CO2, you would run diesel engines with no pollution control, and they would get super high fuel mileage. You had the old Volkswagen Jettas that got 50 miles per gallon. Well, the EPA ran them out of the country. Objectively, a Volkswagen that is getting 50 miles per gallon is going to emit less CO2 than a car that is getting 20 miles per gallon. Because if you're burning less fuel, you're emitting less carbon. It's that simple. You're using less fossil fuels if you have higher fuel mileage. So they find all these other things in the exhaust to regulate, like NOx, nitrous oxide. And that's why these people are so pernicious. They'll just find anything to latch onto to try and take what works and what is inexpensive and make it expensive, unattainable, unaffordable, and unusable. The EPA exists to try and sabotage the standard of living of every American. And I'm someone who cares very deeply about the environment. I'm someone who is very much against, most, development of pristine lands. I want to preserve the actual environment, forests and swamps and all that stuff. I don't believe in the environmentalism of the laptop class, of the Greta Thunbergs of the world, which just happens to fit so well into the corporate oligarchs' plans. A much greater threat to our environment. I shouldn't say this. I'll let you decide. What do you think is a much greater threat to our environment? A housing bubble, which causes these corporate behemoth housing developers to gobble up, thousands and thousands of acres and clear cut all of it to build these tracts of row houses, which are totally sterile environments covered in pavement, whether it's a concrete slab, a concrete driveway, asphalt roadways with a little strip of grass, there next to the sidewalk. Building all these houses when we already have more houses than people, when birth rates have declined rapidly, when people don't need as big a houses as they used to because they're not having a lot of kids. People don't need a 4-bedroom house these days because, if you're lucky, a couple will produce one child. Most households really only need 1 bedroom, maybe 2 for a guest room. And yet, because there's a housing bubble, that drives entrepreneurial companies to go gobble up this land, completely devastate the local environment, and replace it with these houses that are marketable and can be mortgaged, and then those mortgages can be packaged into mortgage-backed securities by Fannie and Freddie and sold to Wall Street. That's the kind of environmental damage that I see with my own 2 eyes and that actually matters. The crap that the EPA worries about is nonsense. The EPA thinks that me driving a 30-year-old vehicle or a 50-year-old vehicle, if it were built today, the EPA would throw me in prison or would throw the manufacturer in prison because, oh my gosh, it's such a harm to the environment. I mean, what utter bullshit. Who believes this crap? I mean, these laptop libs will tweet about how terrible these carbon emissions are from inside of their brand new home that was built atop an old growth forest. And not to mention that when they build these neighborhoods, because Florida is so wet, and they build them on a concrete slab instead of raising up the houses on posts or something like they used to, what they end up doing is they raise up all the land, quite a few feet. And so what does that do? That creates a problem where water is going to displace water, and it's going to run off into all the surrounding areas. So if there is any pristine lands surrounding that, they're going to flood. Or if you have agricultural lands around there, let's say cattle or horses or something like that, the fields are going to become flooded more than usual. The animals will get hoof rot. I mean, there's all these problems. Yet the EPA is concerned about a half a degree change in the average temperatures over 150 years. And so in order to avoid that horror and the devastation that it will wreak on our environment, we all have to live in squalor with unaffordable energy. It's nonsense, and it needs to be called out constantly until these people are ashamed to leave their homes, until they're embarrassed to tell their friends that they work for the EPA. People need to hold the EPA in at least as much contempt as the IRS. I think IRS employees are embarrassed to tell their friends that they work for the IRS. Nobody likes them, nor should they. If you do work for the IRS, you should be ashamed of yourself. Unequivocally, no matter who you are. I don't care if you're a good person the rest of your life. You're a bad person at work. And if you're a bad person at work, hard to say that you're a good person overall. because you hurt people for a living. And that's exactly what people at the EPA do. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.